I don't know. I think it's not just people who have come to Canada from places where anti-Semitism and anti-Americanism are normal. I think the scariest thing for me is that old stock Canadians, if I can use that term, who go to these universities have the cultural Marxism matrix where they see the world as oppressor and oppressed, and they've decided that Israel is the oppressor here. And so they've excused any form of barbarism. I'm more scared about, long-time Canadians going to university and turned into amoral justifiers of barbarism. In some ways, I'm more scared of that than I am of someone who came here from Somalia or Afghanistan or Syria cheering that on. I don't know. I think it's a terrible and terrifying coalition. But what do you make of those? Do you think it's those two streams? People who have come here and haven't assimilated, but also people born and raised here who have been twisted by Marxism, by wokeism, to hate anything of the West. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good analysis of what we're seeing and who we're seeing out rallying in support. It's basically a coalition of radical Islamists and people who just don't accept the West and who have perhaps held on to grievances from their homeland, and they brought them here into Canada, which is a problem that I'm sure we'll discuss during this interview. And then you also have the generation that's just been completely steeped in wokeism, and this is the outcome of the diversity, equity, and inclusion mantras that rule on college campuses and throughout our institutions. People look at the situation and they see, I think wrongly, they think that Jews are the colonizers, that Jews are white supremacists that have somehow taken over in the Middle East, and that because they're rich and the Palestinians are poor, forget about all the governance, all the leadership, forget about all the details of the history. They just see it sort of black and white. One side's rich, one side's poor, one side's white, one side's not. Although, any of these arguments are completely ridiculous and fall apart under even the slightest bit of scrutiny. Ezra, I visited Israel back in 2015. I visited the West Bank and the Palestinian territories as well. And one of the things that it immediately struck me was that the Israelis, the Jews, it was hard to distinguish them from the Arab Palestinians because they all look the same. They're all from the same parts of the world. So many of the people in Israel are actually displaced Jews from other Middle Eastern countries because as many as 1 million Jews were expelled from Muslim countries during the 20th century, something, an ethnic cleansing that we don't often hear about or talk about. So obviously the situation is so much more complex than the sort of slogans that we hear at these rallies. But I think you're right. I think that the most concerning part about these rallies and about the public opinion polls we've seen is the generation, Gen Z, I guess you call them, folks under 25, and how the support sort of flips. The older that you are, this is a poll in the United States, the older that you are, the more likely you are to support Israel and its right to defend itself. And the younger you are, especially that generation, sort of 18 to 25-year-olds, overwhelmingly support Hamas and the Palestinian terror against Israel, which is concerning. Although I will just put a little caveat on all of that. When I look at Canadian public opinion polls, Ezra, it does give me hope because I don't see the popular mass. I think that overwhelmingly Canadians do support Israel. I think I saw a recent public opinion poll that said over 80% of Canadians believe that Israel has a right to defend itself and that Israel is in the right. So, despite all the propaganda and all the loud protesters and marches, I don't think that represents a majority or even a plurality of any generation.
I'm glad to hear you say that on the Canadian side. I went deep on that Harvard-Harris poll a few weeks ago that showed exactly what you said. Senior citizens, 95% support Israel, but the cohort that's in school right now, it's 50-50. That's terrifying to me. But I want to find some hope. And here's what I know. For example, the dictatorship of Iran has troublemakers in Canada, and they have had for years. They sponsor, for example, Al-Quds Day, which is an anti-Semitic rally, which they have in Toronto all the time. And you can spot these agents of Iran. They dress in a certain way and they sort of have a look to them. They're sort of parade marshals and organizers. I've seen them do provocative marches through the Jewish community in Toronto in years past. So I think what I see is not, I think you see young people who like to protest anything, and protesting for Palestine is cool. I think you see hard left wingers. Like I was in London the other day, I'd say about a quarter of the people marching in that big protest were just old labor radicals who, would sign up with anything anti-Western. And right now the strong horse is the Palestinian movement. So I think a lot of it is stimulated and artificial. But listen, they still did get 100,000 people marching in London. They still did get tens of thousands in Montreal. I mean, the other day, a preacher, Adil Trikawi, was preaching to 10 or 20,000 people in Montreal, preaching death to he was preaching jihad. Let me ask you this. Where are all the people who would take a magnifying glass and say, oh, they made the OK symbol with their hands. That's a coded form of white supremacy. Oh, those truckers, honk, honk. That stands for Heil Hitler, HH. Like we saw this kind of exquisite phrenology, these tea leaf readers finding, racism in any conservative. You have groups like Canadian Anti-Hate Network, who were paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to look for right-wing hate. You have 14 human rights commissions in Canada, one for every province, territory, and the federal government. All of these hate finders, these professional hate finders, have been silent when you have actual swastika flags, actual death to the Jews chants. I'm starting to believe, Candice, that none of them were actually against hate or violence at all. They just were against hate for them, and they use that as a demonization of conservatives. We've got, not quite pogroms in Canada, although they tried to torch a synagogue in Montreal. And all of these groups are silent as a mouse. It's as if they've all gone on vacation. What do you make of the anti-hate industry losing its voice in the most hateful month in Canadian history, probably?
Well, Ezra, they've all been completely exposed. I mean, we can tell that the anti-hate network are nothing but a group of hate hustlers. Nothing in their mandate, by the way, says that they are only supposed to look at right-wing extremism. And yet that's what the lead of that group said on social media the other day, that apparently they only have the mandate and the cash to look at extreme right-wing violence, which is why they've remained completely silent. Well, at least that they're admitting that the issues here are not on the right, they're on the left and in the Islamist communities. But what good is a government-funded organization that refuses to look at 50% plus of the population and turns a blind eye to truly horrific incidents like a synagogue being firebombed, Jewish businesses throughout Toronto being boycotted and harassed and having property damage done against them, people getting assaulted, people getting threatened. There are some real problems happening at these marches, and I'm pretty bold and pretty bullish on free speech. I think it's incredibly important. I think that everyone has the right to peaceful protest and to peaceful assembly. We fought and advocated on that when it came to the Freedom Convoy, that yes, these people do have the right to go to Parliament Hill and let their voice be heard. We see it all the time with left-wing protests. We see left-wing sit-ins constantly, and they don't get, to your point, they don't get the kind of scrutiny that the trucker convoy did. We had one anonymous masked provocateur show up with a Nazi flag. From best I can tell, he waved that flag for a good 5 minutes, long enough to have a couple of people, shoot some photos of him. And all of a sudden, every single trucker, every single person that was supporting that movement was smeared as a Nazi. And yet, Ezra, just this past weekend, I saw Nazi swastikas at rallies in Ottawa and Edmonton. And then to your point, we heard explicit calls for violence and incitement of genocide against Jews by a preacher in Montreal. And, these groups are silent. Not only that, but then you have the sort of moral equivocation and cowardice of liberal leaders and progressives saying that we have to condemn hate of all kinds. And it's not just anti-Semitism that is a problem, but supposedly it's also Islamophobia. I'm sorry, I haven't seen huge, public I haven't seen public attacks against Muslims in the past month. I haven't seen Muslim businesses being harassed and targeted and boycotted. I haven't seen news reports of Muslims getting assaulted on the streets. I haven't seen threats and calls to violence against Muslims like I do against Jews every single day on social media. Every few minutes, there's a new post. Even in Windsor, Ontario, even in small communities, we see threats against Jews and against the state of Israel. And for some reason, our politicians can't even muster up the courage, Ezra, to condemn anti-Semitism. It's quite a sad state of affairs on the political left in Canada.